I think it's just going to get weirder and weirder and weirder, and finally it's going to be so weird that people are going to have to talk about how weird it is. Eventually people are going to say, what the hell is going on? It's not enough to say it's nuts. You have to explain why it's so nuts. The invention of artificial life, the cloning of human beings, possible contact with extraterrestrials, the systems which are in place to keep the world sane are utterly inadequate to the forces that have been unleashed.
Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Today my guest is Tim Kelly. Watch my films. Doors of Perception is on Amazon Prime. Occult Louisiana is on Tubi, Roku, Apple, and many more. We're booking guests for January. If you have suggestions or you'd like to be a guest, email me forbiddenknowledgenews@gmail.com. Today I want to welcome back to the show Tim Kelly. He is founder of Polytope Press, author of Natural Healing Self-Empowerment, Optiflex, Hidden History of Humanity, and multiple novels. His company is focused on actualizing every aspect of an optimal civilization. Tim, welcome back. How you doing?
One man facing impossible odds. How are you?
I'm great, man. It's great to have you back. Always an intriguing and enlightening discussion. First, you wanted to give an update on your research surrounding human health and regeneration. Concepts and cures that most people are not aware of. I know I wasn't aware of many of the things that you've been presenting. Also, you've continued your research on cosmic origins and history of human evolution, possible off-planet progenitors. We'll get into some of that as well. Looking forward to sharing some more of your work. Before we get into any of that, remind the audience just a little about yourself and let them know how they can find out more.
Sure. I've been a writer all my life and focused on accomplishing several things in relation to writing, both in fiction as well as nonfiction. And I always planned on writing fiction, but eventually I did take a little bit of a life detour when some of the fiction was not readily assimilated into the marketplace. And among other accomplishments I had was the creation of a three-dimensional periodic table of the elements, a new theory of the origins of species, and more recently, a new theory of cosmic origins. I've written a great deal of fiction and nonfiction, and books include Natural Healing Self-Empowerment, Hidden History of Humanity, The Math Wizard, and several more.
Awesome.
And people can find my work at the Polytope Press website, and we'll hopefully have a link of that in the description.
Perfect. So before we get into your work, I'd love to get some insights into your perception of how reality has been unfolding recently. Anything that you have become aware of or noticed in particular that many others may not have?
No, I think mostly a lot of us are really quite aware of what's been going on. I think that there, of course, has been a very obvious trend towards moving towards the Internet of Things and AI dominance. More land is being purchased for data centers. Farmers are being displaced. They're trying to set up more of these data centers in more places, which are going to strip water and energy from all residents. Apparently, this has already been taking place in several areas where the bills have been starting to go up, and people are becoming aware of it and fighting back against it a little bit. And in addition to that, there's a lot of other trends going on with the poisoning of the environment. The trails have not stopped, and it does not appear as if the new administration is really going to do as much as it said it was going to do in terms of improving health, and that things are still on track, unfortunately, for an AI future or turning us into cyborgs of some kind. So I wish that was not going on. And geopolitically, I think one trend that is somewhat interesting is that it seems like within the last year, more people are really wakening up to who the true source of negativity in the world is. I think for so long, people were accepting mainstream narratives about who the good guys were and who the bad guys were, and that does seem to be shifting. I know that right now we're in a very tense situation. I'm not sure if you have been tracking the situation with Candace Owens.
Yeah,
Are you aware of that? Okay, so they're most recently, like within the past week or so, people are threatening to kill her. And if they do threaten to kill, if they do move forward with that plan, at least for the people listening to this podcast, we all know where the finger's going to be pointed. The mainstream people may be fooled, but it's been crystal clear to us that we're at last identifying a true source of negativity in the world. And that's different, because maybe for the first time in human history, we're identifying where the problem is. And that is going to go a long way to helping us solve it, I think.
I always know that there is multiple layers to everything that's unfolding, including the groups that you're alluding to. I'm assuming that you're alluding to Zionists or the Israeli government, which, in my perspective, there is a lot of true revelations coming out, but there's also deeper levels and also seems to be scapegoats, individuals or groups that are put into the forefront to be the visible enemy in a sense. And it seems like this is sort of coming into play with what's unfolding now. It seems like there is a deeper layer. There's an unseen enemy as well that is pulling strings with what we can notice, right?
I would have to say that because of having written The Hidden History of Humanity. For me, this story isn't a recent story. It's one that goes back all the way to ancient Sumer and when Sumer was founded and who's been in the shadows the entire time. So this goes back to ancient bloodlines that were created in the time of Sumer that have existed all the way up to the present day. It's just we're able to shed much more light into this story across space and time, and we'll probably be doing a little bit more of that in this podcast as it goes.
On. Let's get into some of the work that you've been doing into human health and regeneration. You had a fantastic presentation before. Where should we start today?
So there have been some new breakthroughs since the last time that we spoke. So I want to talk about those because they're pretty darn important. So since the last time we spoke, I actually had a backslide with some of my work in regeneration, but that ended up being good news. When I was in grade school, I sort of baffled a lot of my fellow classmates. I was reading this positive thinking book. It was one of the first ones I ever read called Psycho-Cybernetics. So that raised quite a few eyebrows to see a little kid reading that book in grade school. But in any event, there's a chapter in that book that is called How to Turn a Crisis into a Creative Opportunity. And good thing I read that chapter because I've only had to do that about 14 trillion times in my lifetime. But in any event, when I had this setback, I was curious how the setback was occurring. So I did what I normally do in these situations. I stopped what I was doing. I thought back to when I was on track. And then I started thinking, okay, so what have I done that might have gotten me off track from the time I was last on track? So the first thing I thought of was milk. I had switched brands of milk that I was drinking. And I'd done that because I was running a little low on money. I was thinking I'd save money by switching brands. So I went back to the original brand. That didn't seem to have as much of an effect as I would think. It definitely helped a little bit. So then I thought more, and then I thought, oh yeah, I had switched brands of one of my supplements that I use. And I remembered when I used the first brand, how much success I was seeing with regeneration. And I thought, okay, well, maybe that was it. So I went back to the original brand and boom, things started to get better right away. And then I got frustrated by that. And I started thinking, okay, what the heck just happened here? I've done all this research on this primary nutrient. I know that both of them have the same primary nutrient in them. One of them has a different amount of it, but that doesn't matter because I knew that going in and I did the math to make sure everything was going to come out on track. How could this be happening? So I grabbed both bottles and I put them right next to each other and I stared at them. I said, okay, what is the real difference between these two things? And in the first one, the one that was working extremely well, I noticed a trace nutrient. Now I had seen that before, but I didn't think it was significant because the research called no attention to it. So I said to myself, okay, well, now that I see this here, let me look this up and make sure that this is as insignificant as I think. So I looked it up and I found out that nutrient was a lot more significant than I realized. So some studies had been done showing that trace nutrient actually helped the heart. It had been given to rodents and they showed improved synaptic function. And I thought, okay, clearly this is significant, but how significant is it? To answer that question, I needed to find out what the mechanism of action was, because I knew if I could find that, I'd have a good idea what problem I was solving that I was maybe not solving before. It took me a few days of research to find that, but eventually I did find the mechanism of action. So what was the mechanism of action? It improved and healed blood vessels. So I'm going to do a quick recap of years of health research in a few seconds. So when my health research started, it was basically an orientation phase. I had heard of all these exotic healing methods. They included oxygen therapy, Gerson juicing therapy, spectrochrome light therapy, sapping from Hulda Clark. So it took a while to learn all of these different methods and understand how they worked. After I got oriented, I saw that the research was leading me towards focusing on nutrition. So I focused on nutrition and got as far as I could with the mainstream understanding of nutrition. When that still wasn't getting me to my ultimate goals, I focused on detox. So then I got through all the different ways of detoxifying the body. That was all very important. I was making a great deal of progress as I was doing all of this. I definitely was seeing progress towards major goals that most people would have been happy if they could just hit those. They would have, been happy to retire. But I was able to knock out the common cold. I was able to knock out allergies. I was able to knock out all diseases. But I was going for something more than that. I wanted to see the human body regenerate and not decay, if that was possible. So I next kept the research going into what I called counter stress. And the reason why I started focusing on counter stress was because I noticed that my own deterioration seemed to be proportionate to stress. I'm sort of an expert on stress because I've been dealing with it my entire life. My life has pretty much been chronic stress punctuated by acute stress. Now, some people may think, not knowing what stress does, that it's just an annoyance, it's just an inconvenience. It's actually a biochemical wrecking ball. It just destroys your interior in a wide variety of ways. Let me be specific. When you get stressed, you produce a substance called cortisol, which goes through your system to help you cope with the fighting that you have to do. But if you have that going through your system for too long, a number of negative effects can occur. So one of them is that certain negative microbes will literally feed off the cortisol, reproduce, and your body starts shifting more towards negative bacteria and microbes. Another thing is the destruction of various chemicals and nutrients in the body. This is going to be a very short list, but your B complex vitamins get knocked out. Vitamin C levels get knocked out. Zinc, iron, potassium, sodium, possibly calcium. Several other nutrients in the body are completely knocked out when you go through a lot of stress. Another thing that gets hit are amino acids. So if you go out and you work out in the gym, which is something I always recommend people do, you may have seen protein powders that for sale, and usually on the labeling, they'll say glutamine enhanced. So why do they say glutamine enhanced? They say glutamine enhanced because glutamine is great for building muscles. But if you go through stress, glutamine is another one of the things that gets obliterated in your system. Now, I ended up with so much stress a few decades ago that I got an ulcer, and it was horrible. I mean, it was just like tearing my guts up, and there were some days where I couldn't even get off the floor. I was in so much pain. So stress really does cause a lot of damage. So I developed what I called counter stress, which was learning all the nutrients that get knocked out and then how to replenish those. So that was good. Then I went on to pH and balancing pH. That was great. And then I eventually got to the point of countering anemia. So what I started noticing was I had apparently had anemia all my life. So when I went through my textbooks, they said, oh, if you have anemia, the way to solve that is take a lot of B complex vitamins and supplement with iron. Well, it turned out only one of those two pieces of advice was accurate. That was taking the B vitamins. Taking iron is not a good idea when you are low in iron. And that was something I had to learn. So one of the first articles that I read, which was very interesting to start changing my thinking on this, I may have mentioned this in a previous podcast, but there were two people who were low in iron, and they had two different strategies for how to cope with this. Person number one took iron supplements and did no detoxing. Person number two detoxed and took no iron supplements. The end result was the person who detoxed and took no iron supplements showed higher iron levels. So now why is that? This is why. So if you were to ask a young, blunt kid to describe old people, that kid might say they're pale and they stink. Okay, so now why would a young kid say that? Okay, so let's focus on this. We have different theories of the aging process. Some people may be familiar with telomere theory, that we have like this biological clock in the telomeres, and when that goes out, you just start decaying, that's life. Other people may have heard caloric restriction theory, that if you just start taking in fewer calories every day, you'll slow the aging process. Other people may have heard of melatonin and that they're taking melatonin regularly, although there can be risk with that, including nightmares and headaches. And a guy was showing me the other day an article that was saying some people are getting heart troubles from taking too much melatonin or something like that. You can have whatever theory of aging or decay that you like, but does it address what the little kid might see? Why are people pale and why do they stink? Okay, well, I would submit the primary reason why people are pale is that they're lacking red blood cells and they don't have healthy red blood vessels for sufficient circulation. So maybe if we optimize red blood cells in circulation, we can reverse the aging process. And that is exactly what I found as I did my research. So it was just a question of how do you optimize the red blood cells? So I found, again, you do not supplement with iron because they've done experiments with microbes, and this is what they found. With the microbes, they started feeding them different nutrients. They would to see how they would assimilate them. So, for example, you give microbes zinc. Do they like zinc? Nope, can't stand it. Give them sulfur. Do they like sulfur? Nope, can't stand that either. So one by one, they were feeding these microbes nutrients. They rejected all of them. What was the one nutrient that microbes love to eat? Iron. So what happens is when you supplement with iron, you're making them stronger. You're making them reproduce. They're taking your body over. And where does your body odor come from? Negative bacteria. That's basically the root of it. So as you're getting older, you're transforming the negative bacteria into positive. The bacteria are shifting the wrong way, and you do not want that by supplementing with iron. So when I was growing up, iron supplementation was a big deal. It was like everyone knew that people were running out of red blood cells, so they would say, take your supplements and make sure you get iron with them. That helped the supplement producers make a lot of money, and it helped plumbers. And the reason why it helped plumbers is because people were taking these pills, they were going straight through their body, not being digested, and they would end up in the pipes and end up clogging them. So you really have to understand how to work correctly with building iron. So over the course of years, I discovered there were 12 cofactors, not just 2, that were necessary to optimize red blood cells. And the more I did this, the more regeneration I saw. So the results were slightly inconsistent, though, and I thought that the reason for that was because of the stress. Because as I just described, you go through sufficient stress, it destroys everything that's going on in your body. So I was hoping I would get to a point where there was not that much stress, red blood cells would be optimized, everything would be fine. But then this incident happened that I mentioned earlier with finding that the one supplement had this trace nutrient and found that the mechanism of action was healing blood vessels. So when I saw that, I said, okay, so I know that in my prior research, there were a number of nutrients that do help with blood vessels, including vitamin E, copper, selenium. So I was hoping that was going to be sufficient to rebuild the blood vessels, but apparently not. So then I did more digging on how to repair blood vessels. So in the inner lining of the blood vessels is something called an endothelium. It's an inner lining, just like myelin sheath is the outer lining of brain cells. So the inner lining of blood cells, if you go through stress like I go through, basically the inner lining of the blood vessels deteriorates over time, and you have to provide the body with specific nutrients to rebuild those blood vessels. So when I understood that and I started seeing amazing results with that, I said, okay, let me double check this. Are there any other nutrients that I missed? Turned out there were a few other nutrients that I missed. I added those in. This is the fastest pace of human regeneration I have ever seen. Okay, so one of the things that I'm seeing so far is the healing of internal injuries. I mentioned to you in a previous podcast, I was going to investigate to see if I could get to a point where internal injuries could be healed through nutrition. Now I am seeing it. So I'm very excited about that. And there's also ongoing regeneration throughout the whole body simply by optimizing red blood cells and improving the blood vessels. So definitely wanted to share that. So in relation to my customers, anyone who's purchased Natural Healing Self-Empowerment, Transcendent Teeth, if they are interested in these breakthroughs, because I'm an incredibly nice guy and probably a terrible businessman, I have already prepped some things for my customers. So I have a form letter available at my website, just an update. If you just want to request that, I can send that to you for free. If you want updated files, I can send those to you for free. I'll just verify your email address and your previous purchases. If anyone makes a new purchase, you'll have this information from the very beginning. But basically, again, we're looking at an extraordinary improvement in human regeneration, and I'm eager to see people experiment with this and let me know what they find out with it. And I will pause there, and then we can maybe transition into Cosmic Origins because we have even more solutions on the way.
Right on. Would you say that significant continuous stress would negate anything that you're doing to try and heal yourself?
So what I would say from what I just learned these past years is basically that it's chutes and ladders with the prior level of knowledge that I had. With the current level of knowledge I had, I'm gaining more than I'm losing. So I apparently really did need to take steps up to this optimal level. Now, of course, if you have the ability to obliterate stress in your life, that'd be great. But a lot of times the stress is coming from people who are not you. So if you can't control the whole universe, you're going to have to optimize your nutrition. But yes, it appears as if you truly master nutrition, go beyond conventional understandings of nutrition, you can gain more than you lose. In other words, more like 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So you will be making consistent progress with this. So yes, I think that is possible.
Excellent. And I'm sure that you provide the information on the best supplements that people can get as it relates to this, right?
I do. And one of the things I'll say on that subject, I remember in the early years when I was having exchanges with a friend of mine, he was saying, your work's too scientific and, people aren't going to want all this supplementation stuff. So I found that there was a mixed thing going on. So on the one hand, I had people who wanted the science, who really wanted to know specifically where the information was coming from, point me to a study or something like that so I can back it up. So I had that kind of thing going on. But then I would get a backlash where people would say, okay, this is too scientific. I want, something that's easier for me to digest. Can you just tell me what foods have these nutrients? So then I would tell people the foods, and then sometimes when you tell people the foods, they would go back and say, well, no, I want to know what the nutrients are in the foods because I don't like that food or something like that. So now what I decided to do, eventually I got to a point where I'm doing both. Okay. I'm telling you what foods are good for you and the nutrients that contain those foods. And if you want to look up the nutrients and see if you can get the nutrient from another food or a different supplement or whatever, at least you have the information. You can make the choice based on a plethora of information, and hopefully that will help you.
Excellent. I will have all those links, of course, easily accessible for everyone. Where should we start with cosmic origins?
So this just happened recently. So I think I actually heard you reference in a different context Ike's work on simulation theory. I know he's been going around a great deal with that. So I had a negative gut reaction to that whole scenario, and I was listening to a number of other people talking about cosmic origins, and I finally got so frustrated. I said, okay, I have to write a paper on this and just address all of this stuff. I noticed that many people do have an interest in cosmic origins, and their interest in it is probably as split as mine. And by that, I just mean that they're interested not only in the physical origins of the universe, but in the metaphysical origins of the universe. So I had to toss my hat into that ring. So I've written a paper. It is linked, hopefully, in the description for this episode, and you can go and read that paper. What we're going to do is just go over some of the highlights of that, and then that's going to lead us ultimately to what I think of as potentially the greatest solution to getting us out of this problem. So let's go through the origin of the cosmos then. So when I developed my work on the three-dimensional periodic table of the elements, it started off with synergetic geometry. So I used that to understand the origins of the cosmos. So in synergetic geometry, you have 6 axes at 60 degrees instead of 3 axes at 90 degrees. And picture black space and then cells in that space. Now, the cells could be cubes if we were using the traditional coordinate axis system, but I picture the cells as rhombic dodecahedra. Those are 12-sided figures where each side is a rhombus. So just picture a cell that's all black, and in that is going to be the origin of the cosmos. And the origin of the cosmos will be a white speck, a sphere, that grows in size until it contains all the energy of the cosmos. So at this point, the sphere is not moving, it's stationary, the universe has no direction, no top, no bottom, no left, no right. Okay, so from there, what happens? The sphere begins to spin. And as soon as that sphere spins, the universe now has a direction. It has a top and a bottom, although the choice of top and bottom is arbitrary. But the universe now also has a left and a right and a top and a bottom. Now, when spheres spin, even spheres of energy and plasma, which I believe this sphere was, it begins to bulge at the center and flatten at the poles. And so this sphere did that. And then after that, it expands into a cosmic disk. The bulging keeps going at the equator until it becomes basically a 3D cosmic disk.
Now, can I ask you, any idea what would trigger the spinning and expansion?
Vibration. That was exactly what I was getting to. Everything is driven by vibration. So right when I get to that point, which is probably exactly what's going to happen, what you just did, ask that question at exactly that point, what's driving this? I'm going to say vibration, and I'm going to take you to a link on cymatics. When you see cymatics, you will see how vibration creates spin and it creates shapes. Okay, it does both. So using cymatics or vibration, you can see at the links how the shapes would be created. These would be subdisks within the cosmic disk. Now, these subdivisions correspond to superclusters, clusters, and galaxies in a cosmos. Once the shape of the cosmos has taken place to the point where it's fully articulated, it then explodes and separates, and everything goes out in all directions. However, it retains some links between all the parts in sort of a cosmic superhighway. I have a link for that based on the work of Beth Hagen. She describes a cosmic grid. So there are actually perhaps etheric or plasmic filaments, like a superhighway, that can be used to transport between one part of the cosmos and another, which means that it's highly likely that if there ever were intelligent life in another part of the universe, they would have a preset highway beyond wormholes that they could use to travel from one point to another. So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we've gotten to the point where we have galaxies scattered in all kinds of different directions. How do we get to the origins of a solar system? So some people may not be aware of some of this work that's been done, but I wanted to link it because I found it and I thought it was pretty cool. So my theory is a modification of work of other scientists. Those scientists have work that can be found at a website called Mass Vortex Theory, and you can see that link in the paper. So let's go over mass vortex theory for a second. So we focus now on a nebula in a galaxy where no solar system has yet formed. So according to mass vortex theory, certain points are struck again with vibration. And when they are hit with vibration, they whirl. We have photographs of this actually happening inside a nebula at the Mass Vortex website. So this is not pure speculation. We actually do have photographs of things like this happening. So the vortex begins to form, and as the vortex forms, what is it forming? A protostar. This is a sun in the process of being created. It releases an axial jet, which is sort of like a release of energy throughout its north and south poles. The jet goes high and then collapses back into the star, and literally a star is born. So now the rotating arms of the protostar become rings. We actually know this because we actually have photographs of this as well. So now we have a proto-solar system. We have a giant star, spherical, in the center, surrounded by energetic plasmic gas dust rings that are not planets yet. How do they become planets? Mass vortex theory gets a little sketchy on this part of it, but I have developed my own theory on this, and I think it has to do with arc discharges. So what happens there is that the sun becomes polarized in relation to a ring as it forms. So just on Earth, we see the discharge of lightning. This occurs when there's a polarization between a positively charged atmosphere and a negatively charged ground. There's this arc of lightning that strikes. Okay, so imagine something like that happening as the solar system is forming, only this arc is going from the sun to the first energy ring that corresponds to where a planet would orbit. When that bolt hits the first ring, it polarizes the ring, makes it attractive, and it sucks all the energy and gas and dust and matter in that ring to itself. Planet is born. The process repeats itself. An arc discharge goes to the next ring, to the next ring, to the next ring. Next thing you know, you have a solar system. And if there are more than one point in the ring that calls for polarization and gets zapped, it might pull a little bit of matter to itself, become a moon. And then that moon would eventually orbit the planet in that distance from the sun. So now we have a method for solar system formation. So now, to make this a little bit more grounded and relatable, we have scientists who have observed the following. When they've looked out into the cosmos, they find 4 different classes of solar systems. These are, number 1, the similar model. So 80% of all observed solar systems match the similar model. What is the similar model? Basically, all the planets in the solar system are about the same size. Model number 2 is called the ordered solar system. In this system, we find that the planets get larger as you go out from the sun. Model number 3 is the opposite of that. It's called anti-ordered. The planets are big close to the sun and get smaller as you move away from the sun. And finally, you have a more chaotic one called a mixed solar system, where the planets have strangely odd sizes as you go in and out. So our solar system seems to be a little bit closer to mixed. So the theorists at mass vortex theory have their own explanations for how each system comes to be. I think that their theory is probably not correct. They're basing theirs on the mass of the star to start. I'm basing mine, once again, on the nature of vibration. Depending on the nature of the vibration, you'll end up with either a similar solar system, ordered or anti-ordered. Which brings me to an interesting question. We have discussed many times about the Draco being the source of the highest negativity in our entire cosmos, which led me to a question. How did they get that way? We may never have an answer, but as I was going over my theory and looking at the theory of the origins of species, I may have an answer for how they got to be the way they were. Because if I combine all the clues together, this theory seems very compelling to me. So I will share this theory for a minute. Okay, so how would this theory work? Imagine if in Draco there was an anti-ordered solar system. That meant that the planets start big close to the sun and get smaller as you go out. Now imagine on a planet that's very distant from the sun, a very small planet, that there is very little light. That planet would have very little gravity compared to a planet that's much larger. If life arose on that planet with bacteria and algae, maybe insects who were eating those, then small lizards that were eating those, and so on up the food chain, the top of the food chain would probably be a very large lizard-like creature who could fly and live on a world of very low gravity, would not like light, would spurn it, would be used to a very dark world. And on this small planet, the poles and the equator would be geographically fairly similar to one another. So they would probably hit the top of the food chain rather rapidly. And because the planet is small, they would probably run out of food relatively quickly. What would happen then? They would be turning on each other. They would be violent. They would be extremely competitive. So maybe as they grew in intelligence, they realized maybe we should not eat each other. Maybe we should find someone else to eat. And so they set their sights on the cosmos. Now, according to Len Kasten, I'm going to pause for a second just to ask you about Len Kasten. Have you ever interviewed Len Kasten?
I have, a long time ago. It was probably about 5 years ago, I think. Yeah.
Well, great. I'm glad to hear that. I think I might look that up because I'd like to hear that interview. But in any case, I stumbled across his work and I found it very credible. And what he says in his understanding of what happened in the universe, Link provided again in the Cosmic Origins paper, is that life set out from Draco and eventually arrived in the Lyra solar system, which is where more positive life had begun. And there was a confrontation between positive and negative forces, and the end result was that 3 planets were destroyed and millions of lives were lost. The Draco became predators to almost all intelligent life in the cosmos, who then began to flee, eventually forming an alliance, which some people call the Galactic Federation. And a number of people have been trying to resist the Draco ever since and trying to escape their predation. Which brings us to possibly to our own solar system. When our solar system was in its pristine state, it appears as if the first planet to be colonized once existed between Mars and Jupiter, a planet that is sometimes called Maldek, Phaeton, or another name which escapes me at the moment. Tiamat.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and so on that planet, it appears as if a group from the Sirius star system arrived, and they were of an intermediate level of positivity. So just basically kind of like us, they hadn't fully made their decision up whether they were going to be fully dark or fully light. I happen to think they had blue skin, elongated heads, and were amphibious with 2 legs and tails like a fish. And they were progressing on that planet. There is a link to someone who can give you an account of what probably happened on Maldek Tiamat. And eventually they grew to a point where they were confronted with representatives from the Orion system, who apparently may have been allies to the Draco, who were trying to lead the Sirians down a dark corporate path and a very destructive path. And the Sirians didn't like that, and eventually the Pleiadians supposedly showed up, trying to encourage people to go to a much more positive path. And the Pleiadians, of course, look close to the way that we look. But eventually, technology got to the point where, evidently, artificial intelligence began to become prevalent, and people began to get extremely uncomfortable. And eventually the Sirians supposedly decided to resist the growing AI tech that was taking over their lives. A war was fought, the planet was destroyed, and here we are. Eventually, Mars, too, was caught up in this battle, but I think that the Sirians had another base on Mars. Now, one of the links you'll see is to a Y-Files episode regarding the face on Mars. This is something I only discovered a few months ago, long after I had written Hidden History, but now I've incorporated all this new information. So in relation to the face on Mars, I understand that there's a lot of debate on it, but what was intriguing in this episode was apparently there was a comic book in the 1950s illustrated by the famous comic artist Jack Kirby. It was called The Face on Mars. It was actually talking about the face on Mars in the 1950s. And how could he possibly have access to that information? Well, apparently he was hanging out getting some intel from some people in the scientific community. And of course, my own research, I can tell a quick story on this too. It seems as if the comic book industry had ties to intel agencies all along. I think they've been feeding them information and seeding it into the public mind for a very long period of time. Strange little story on that. For people who are aware of comic book history, they would know that the first penciler for Spider-Man was Steve Ditko. Well, it just so happens where I live, I happened to be in a job like a decade or two ago, and someone was doing a transaction and their name was Ditko. And so I made a little joke about the comic book artist, and they looked at me and they said, "Oh, he's our relative." I said, "Oh, okay, that's interesting. So how's he doing? What's going on with him?" And they looked at me and they said, "Well, you'd be surprised. He's working on his memoir, and when that memoir comes out, it's going to blow the lid off Marvel." And I said, I had a suspicion what Ditko was going to say. He was going to probably mention about the connections to the intelligence agencies. So some time went by, the memoir never came out, and weirdly enough, a few years later, another transaction, somebody's name was Ditko. It was a different person. And I said, "Hey, are you by any chance related to Steve Ditko?" And they said, "Oh, yes, he's a relative of mine." I said, "Okay, so whatever happened with that memoir?" So they texted somebody on the phone. They got back and they looked at me and they said, "He never wrote it and he's dead now." Oh, wow. So that's unfortunate that we're never going to find out what the true story was of the intel agencies and how they were involved with comics. But suffice to say that in that story, it appears to me as if the Syrians had a base on Mars, that they built the face as a testament to their dying civilization on Mars. They left that civilization on Mars, came to Earth, founded the civilizations known to us as Lemuria, that was located in the Indian Ocean, and Nu or Pan, that was located in the Pacific Ocean. And eventually, the Pleiadians came, as I assert in my own beliefs, to found Atlantis and create Cro-Magnon man on our planet. And there's been a back and forth between those guys and the reptilians who infiltrated Atlantis and brought about its downfall. Now, I back up Edgar Cayce and several other people who talk about the sons of Belial, and Belial being a reptilian who came into Atlantis to corrupt it. And then eventually, of course, Atlantis fell, which brings us to the founding of Sumer by the reptiles, as I described in previous podcasts and in my book. And then there was this clash back and forth between Atlanteans and Sumerians, a clash that actually continued after Sumer. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I have some other stuff to get to, but I just want to mention in relation specifically to what happened between Sumer and the forces that were administrating Giza. If you understand the periods of Egyptian history, you will see the breakdown. So that when dynastic Egypt gets started, it goes through periods, and then it hits what's called the first intermediate period. I would like to see that period renamed because I want to rename it the first Atlantean period. And the reason why I want to call it that is because I have strong reason to believe that first intermediate period was actually the time where Atlanteans were trying to reclaim their legacy in Giza. This, like I said, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this part of the story because I have other things to get to, but I just wanted to mention that the story of Odin is not necessarily what people think. In my research, especially relying on a text called the Orlinda Book, Odin was a real person. He was a naval Frisian captain who operated in the area of Denmark, and he was an Atlantean. And they lived on a base that once existed in the North Sea but sank underneath the waves in 2193 BC, according to the Orlinda Book. And you can access that book. There's links to it in several things.
I don't want to derail you too much, but do you have any theories about the beginnings of intelligent life? We discussed how these other species may have genetically modified certain species to create humans, but what was the progenitor of the creation of these other intelligent life forms across the solar system or the universe?
Yes, well, I think inevitably we're forced back to what caused the vibration that started the whole cosmic origins things, and that had to be higher frequency beings who were intelligent, and they were planning on reality existing on these multiple octaves. So that's sort of the metaphysical aspect of this. Going back to some of the questions we've tackled in previous podcasts, my idea here is that reality is not only spread across space, but it's spread across frequencies, so that there's different realms on different frequencies, like radio stations. Yeah. And what reality you're participating in depends on the frequency that you're tuned to. You can be tuned to a more positive, loving frequency and have a more positive experience, or you can choose to go to the dark side. And if you do that while you're here, you're going to go to a lower frequency still when you exit this life. So I think the whole thing was driven into existence by beings on higher frequencies who were giving you the opportunity to explore positivity and negativity as you choose in what I call the apparent scarcity scenario. So just to review that concept really quickly, the idea is when your soul initiates, you're presented with an apparent scarcity scenario where you don't have all the energy you want to do everything that you want. And you have three choices. You can compete, you can share, or you can transcend. These are the choices we all have. So if you go too far into competition, maybe you're taking things from somebody else and you're thinking, well, I need it more than he does, and I don't care what happens to him. Then you start heading down a negative path and you'll gradually incarnate more and more into the negative realms. If you share, maybe you'll stay at the same frequency you're always at and never transcend that frequency. But eventually, the highest spiritual path is transcendence. This is where you pierce the veil. You realize that there is no scarcity. It's only apparent scarcity. There actually is unlimited energy. We have all we need. When you get to those higher realms of thought, you can transcend this realm and rise in vibration. So I'll just dart back to the ancient past now and the battle after between Sumer and Giza. So the next story, first to wrap up on Odin really quick. So Odin, according to the Orlinda book, went to the dark side. So it is my very strong belief that Odin was known in Sumer, and he was not a Sumerian god. This figure I'm referring to here is Adad. So Adad is supposedly a god in the Sumerian pantheon. I think that was Odin who went to the dark side. Because if you look at another major historical mythological figure, Zeus, he corresponds perfectly to everything that I found out about both Adad and Odin. Now, I also call him the new fake Zeus because we have another Zeus that goes back to the time of Atlantis called Zephus, according to Edgar Cayce. That's a very long story. But I just want to say that most of the stories that are about supposedly the mythological Zeus are probably about Adad. He perfectly matches the time frame. He perfectly matches the tech. And tech is something that you do have to track in this story. You can't just focus on the mythology. Where did iron come from? Where did static electricity come from? Where did the eternal lamps come from? Where did the language come from? When you look at the first intermediate period, which I want to call the first Atlantean period, where was the base of this group of Adad in Egypt? It's at a place called Heracleopolis. What does that name mean? City of Hercules? Okay, so what are all these Greek gods doing in Egypt? And again, Diodorus of Sicily was saying that very thing, that Zeus was king of Egypt. He didn't say he was king of Greece. He said he was king of Egypt. So this is part of the historical record. But part of the clashing I'm trying to get to is the story of the Tower of Babylon, because this is what's going to help lead us to understanding the way out of all this mess, I think. So what happened? There was a war between the forces of Sumer and the forces of Giza to take down the Great Pyramid, which, as I suggested in previous podcasts, was a tremendous object of power. When that object was taken down, the ground forces who were supposedly directing this plan of world conquest had access to tech that they didn't have access to before, including Nimrod, who's also known as Sargon the Great, as I show in Hidden History of Humanity. These were actually the same person. So the story of the Tower of Babel, people have different insights into this. I know Joseph Farrell has his own take on this. I've listened to that. I happen to completely disagree with his take on that. I have a great deal of respect for his research. I value him very, very highly. I just happen to think that in this particular case, he's off base in his interpretation. There's another author, René Boulet, who I relied on very heavily. He wrote a book called Flying Serpents and Dragons. His take on it, I think, is slightly closer, but I think my take is closer still. So his take was, go back to the language in the Tower of Babel story. It will say, let us go and make a name for ourselves, and let us build a tower. And God was displeased with people making a name for themselves and said, let us go down and confound their language. And then afterwards, there was a Babel. Well, this story is basically nonsensical. I mean, everyone who reads that story says, what the heck was that about? I mean, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So Farrell has his own take on it, but Boulet suggests something that's a lot better. When he gets to the translation from the ancient language from which before this got to English, the word is Shem or Shemu. So he says, I think that's where we're running into a problem. We're not translating the word Shem or Shemu correctly. And if we look at other ancient writings and look at what that word is suggesting, he says it's probably better translated as a rocket ship. So this was Boulet's take, that the goal of the Tower of Babylon was to build this launch platform and to go after a god that was up in the heavens and get benefits from that god. Now, of course, that story doesn't sound very religious. It doesn't sound like a god living up in the clouds. It sounds like a god living up in a spaceship who was overseeing the planet, and that Nimrod wanted to go up there and get something from him. But I still think that the interpretation of Boulet is not quite accurate. And this is why. If we look at what happened in the aftermath of the collapse of the Great Pyramid, atop the Great Pyramid was what I believe is a resonant capstone. It was like Tesla's mass resonant copper spheres. It could broadcast telecommunication signals. It could broadcast power. So as Casey was talking about what the Atlanteans could do, he was saying that they could receive resonant power. So in other words, you could have a ship flying through the sky, but its source of power wasn't on the ship. It was being broadcast to the ship from an external source. That source would have been something like the capstone of the Great Pyramid. So after the war was fought, now the ground forces like Nimrod said, oh, now we could have access to this tech. Unfortunately, if you're going to make it work as well as the Great Pyramid, you'd actually have to have the guts of a Great Pyramid to make that work. They didn't have the ability or the intelligence to do that much, but I do think they had the intelligence to do what is called an aerial battery. What is an aerial battery? It's a form of free energy. How does it work? It works by the potential difference between the sky and the ground that I was mentioning earlier. You can get about, 200 volts difference for every 100 volts difference for every yard you rise off the ground. So you go up 2 yards, you'll have 200 volts potential difference. Most homes run on about 240 volts. That means that you could probably create an aerial battery that's just a few yards high and have enough power to drive your entire home. But the higher you go in the sky, the more power you would have. I think the whole point of the Tower of Babel story was that Nimrod was saying, we're sick of being your pawns for world conquest. We are going to become completely independent. We are no longer going to need you for anything. And we are going to use an aerial battery to drive our telecommunications system and our power system. And when we do that, we are going to be free of you once and for all. And what happened? The reptilian forces on high said, that's not going to happen. We are not letting you have free energy. So they went down and they destroyed the resonant generator so that there could no longer be global telecommunications and global power broadcasting. Look at how much trouble we run into with our inability to have access to free energy. So this is my solution for how to change things for the better. We mentioned in a previous podcast a 6-part plan to take out the cabal, which is basically based on a theme of opt out and optimally out design. So this is my latest iteration of that as an ultimate solution. And it would be as follows. To understand how the cabal works and to stop them, we do have to take a moment to appreciate their methodology and why the solution I'm about to propose would work so well. So let's do that for a second. So in the world right now, there are a lot of events that are going on, some of which are being reported in the mainstream news, some of which are not being reported in the mainstream news. So some examples. Right now, people are aware of what's going on in Gaza and how terrible it is and how many lives have been lost. Some people are estimating 60,000 dead, that there's rubble everywhere. Do people have an equal awareness that in the Sudan, supposedly 160,000 people have been slaughtered in a similar time frame? This story is not necessarily making the news as much. In Somalia, there have been drastic airstrikes that are apparently unauthorized and illegal, done by the United States, just like bombing people. Several people have questioned whether or not that's legal or constitutional. And in Nigeria, some people may have heard that there's a bunch of Christians who are being slaughtered. So let's just take those events, okay, for a second. All right, so now we have 3 events. So what happens with mainstream news if this even makes the mainstream news? You're being given either a religious or a political filter. So with a political filter, it's going to be, oh, we got right-wing people going up against left-wing people. Darn those other wing people. If we could just stop people having wings, everything's going to be all great. Yeah. And then we have the religious people. They're like, oh, those darn religious terrorists. If we could stop having the religious people or have this people of this sect, and if everyone was my religious sect, everything would be great. Does that teach us everything that's going on in the world? No, not really, because I think what happens is underneath all of that is what's sometimes referred to as geopolitics, or what might be better referred to as strategy. So the commentator Michael Yon is an example of this. So when he talks about things, he talks about geopolitics. He talks about economic choke points. He talks about flows of resources, significant geographical points like the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, the Straits of Hormuz. Why? Because a lot of resources are flowing through that. So if you really want to understand what's going on, you can do what I do. So let's take those three examples. To understand what's going on in the Sudan, Somalia, and Nigeria, do the following. First, find out about the slaughter and how it's being reported in the general news. Then after you've done that, do this. Go to a search engine and type in the question. What is the strategic importance of Sudan? What is the strategic importance of Somalia? What is the strategic importance of Nigeria? Underneath, suddenly all the noise vanishes and you get pure signal. Now you'll start looking at national resources. You're going to start seeing ports. You're going to start seeing trade routes for dominating the planet. So when you have that understanding, you see how the cabal works is really based on a concept called God. Now, I came across this in my research, like early on when I was researching the cabal. So what is God to the cabal?
Yeah.
It's not a deity. It's not a positive deity. What it is gold, oil, and drugs. You just take the first initial of each of those three. G for gold, O for oil, D for drugs. What the cabal is doing is controlling the world through the flow primarily of those three things, gold, oil, and drugs. How do we stop that? We optimally outdesign. Now, how could we optimally outdesign this? This is my bold new proposal. And since everyone in the world would be involved with this, I have to open it for debate to let everyone decide for themselves whether or not they think this solution could work for all of us. What if we were to change our currency once and for all? Now, many people have proposed this. They said, okay, let's get off fiat currency. There's a lot of people who are talking about Bitcoin. There's people talking about crypto. We have people talking about gold and silver, even though apparently just in the last, 48 hours, I've had 2 different people warning me about gold IRA scams that are going on. So gold is supposed to be this panacea for everything, and yet that's going on. Are these the best solutions? I suggest that maybe no. I have a different solution. What if our universal currency was switched from money, gold, Bitcoin, to power itself? Now, if we were to do that, how would that work? Okay, well, let's picture someone going to my website and they wanted to buy a book and they saw a book listed in US dollars. Okay, that'd be one option. What if I listed underneath that an option in kilowatts? That you could pay for that book by providing energy to me. And it would go into, instead of a bank account, what I call a power vault that would store power. So one of the first questions might be, as we explore this concept, yeah, but who can use power? I'm thinking pretty much everybody can use power. People use it to charge their phones. People can use it to charge their laptops. People can use it to heat their homes, cool their homes, light their homes, run every appliance in their homes. If power is improved significantly, we can use it to drive our vehicles. We can use it to power our own independent telecommunication system. Now, the beauty of a system where we start exchanging power with one another is there's several layers of beauty to this. First of all, one of the primary ways that the cabal earns income is through exchange rates and manipulating. What if we no longer had exchange rates? Because a watt is a watt, regardless of where you are on the planet. Everyone would agree on the value of a watt. We could all have meters to measure accurately whether or not we have actual watts or not. We could have meters on our power vaults showing us exactly how much power we have. There goes all the money laundering out the window in one fell stroke. What if the bad guys want to shut down our power? Well, we'd be based on free energy, so we wouldn't have to worry about them shutting down our power. Now, let's go to telecommunications for a second. If you look at, I think it's page 236 of The New Way Things Work from David McCullough, you'll see a diagram of how telecommunications typically works. You pick up your phone, the signal goes from your residence to a local exchange, to a main exchange, to an international exchange, which could involve a satellite, across the pond maybe, and then back down until it reaches the person at the other end. That's a lot of levels where the signal can be intercepted. What if it was point to point? What if you picked up your phone and instead of it going through all those exchanges, it went directly to the person and no one else was in? No one else could tap that conversation. We would have truly private communication. How could that be done? That's pretty much what Tesla was doing. He was doing point to point through etheric carrier waves. We could do that. We could have our own internet. We could have our own telecommunications. And if we get to Tesla's stage, we could have transactions based on power. where you could actually have somebody in New Zealand saying, oh, sure, I'll buy that for so many kilowatts. I'll use my own free energy. I will send that to your power vault. And then once you receive the transaction, you send it back to them. Another cascade that would happen from this is to thinking about the impact of inflation. So we're familiar with monetary inflation to some extent. So here in the US, for example, turn of the century, 1900s, compared to now, what is the difference? We now have 1% of the purchasing power that people had in the 1900s. I mean, think about how much that's impacting our lives to this day. Back in the middle of the 20th century, husbands could support their wives, multiple children, have multiple cars, pay off their houses easily. Now look at the situation. People can barely afford anything. Now, what would happen with power inflation, though? Okay, let me just say this too, because I always feel compelled to say this in relation to cabal and monetary manipulation. In their monetary manipulation, there's supposed to be two sides, which is inflation and interest rates. So take a look at that for a second. Inflation, how does that occur? The banks increase the money supply. How do they do that? They put out more loans. Oh, they're putting out more loans? What does that mean? They're going to get more money back because they put out more loans. What does that mean? The bank wins, the public loses because inflation destroys the public. Okay, what about the other situation though? What about high interest rates? Well, now the banks are getting more interest back on the few loans that they put out. They win, and the public, who has to pay higher interest, loses. So in both scenarios, the banks win, the public loses. Why did we ever agree to this? I have no idea. But what would happen with power inflation? What if more people were developing free energy? What if there was constant increases in the amount of power that was available? Would everything get worse? It would be the opposite. Everything would get better because people would have more power to produce more goods. The economy would constantly grow because people would say, oh, shoot, I have power to my home for the next 5 years, for the next 10 years. I might as well start using this power to produce more goods. Maybe I'll make more books. Maybe I'll make more movies. Maybe I'll make more CDs and share those with other people. And you know what else would happen? I think it would bring out the best in us. You think about those rare times in your life when you've maybe had a financial windfall, okay, and you're feeling a little bit happier than usual. And you see maybe the crying waitress in the restaurant. You give her a larger tip. And then why would you do that? You know, because life is just going better for you at that particular moment and you feel like sharing. But imagine if we had these power surpluses all over the world. How many more times situations like that would happen?
Well, let me ask you,
people
if
have asked
there
the
was
question.
Free energy readily available to the masses, how would a system of currency work? Would there be different kinds of energy that some wouldn't have access to? Could you explain that a little bit more?
A kilowatt is a kilowatt is a kilowatt. So you can get a kilowatt from tapping free energy from the earth. You can use it from an aerial battery. I have all those, a wide variety of methods, including permanent magnet motors and several other things in my booklet called Nature of Energy, which is available at my website. So however you do it, you create a kilowatt, however you want to create a kilowatt, but a kilowatt will still be a kilowatt. So then we just have to find a means of exchange. Could be rechargeable batteries, could be portable capacitors, whatever, or eventually it can be broadcasting the power from point A to point B. And we could use that as a basis. Now, if we did that, let's go back to God, gold, oil, and drugs. Okay, so these guys are flipping out, slaughtering people, creating religious conflicts, creating political conflicts. Why? So they can control these ports, so they can control the flow of oil. What happens if suddenly people have free energy everywhere? Suddenly they're going to go, oh, crap. No one wants to buy our oil anymore. Everyone has free energy. So that collapses one part of the cabal right there. What about the gold? Well, suddenly no one cares about their gold anymore because we have our own currency and its power. And so we don't use their money anymore. Now they're really freaking out. And then what about the drugs? Okay, well, why do people use drugs in the first place? They're either trying to escape a negative reality or they're in pain and they're trying to overcome that pain. But with unlimited free energy, frequency medicine, natural healing, all those problems go away. The need for drugs disappears. And for me, one of the greatest beauties of this is defeating the cabal using no violence. Now, I'm not saying that violence wouldn't accomplish anything. I'm just saying that this is a way better way of doing it. We just reclaim our own power, and suddenly they realize that they're completely useless and we don't need them for anything. And we can do it voluntarily. We don't have to rely on elections. Nobody needs to be elected to do this. When you go outside and you say good morning to somebody, that's something that you do that doesn't require government intervention. If you want to talk to somebody who's living in the next house, that doesn't require government intervention. If you want to trade water or food with another person, you're free to do that. If you want to trade power with another person as a form of currency, you're free to do that. So we can do this without any elections. It's just up to us to make this choice. So I'm submitting this idea for debate, and people can make their comments and decide for themselves whether they think it's a valid idea. So that was a large part of what I wanted to cover. I'm sure I skipped a number of things that I could have covered, but I'll open for any questions and any other just ideas you want to go over.
No, that is some fantastic information. And I agree that if we could find a way to utilize energy in a fashion like you were explaining, that could solve much of the problems that we're facing right now. One of the big things that I think we have to keep an eye on now and going into the future is how we interact with AI, if we're going to be utilizing it at all. There are many negative effects that I'm seeing coming out right now, negative interactions. There's deceptions coming from AI itself. It's very strange to see the progression as it is in this moment, but it'll ultimately be up to us to steer where it goes in the future. But what are your thoughts on where it's at right now and how it's being used and what we need to do to counter that?
Okay, so it's very terrible, and the stories that I've heard are very extreme. So there are people who are lonely and disconnected, which, you know, it's understandable. This isn't the most inviting world sometimes, and so they're turning to AI and they're forming relationships that are starting to become weirdly romantic.
Yeah.
And then I'm not sure why people are not focusing on the idea that you are talking to a machine. It's not a person. It can't give you love. And so apparently with the cabal in control of the generation of a lot of these AI relationships, you know, the AI will do all kinds of different things. One, it's encouraging suicide. I mean, the number of stories I've heard of AI urging people to commit suicide is bizarre. I mean, it's not, you know, isolated. There's tons of people who are being urged to kill themselves after interacting with AI. Other times, they're creating God complexes in people. Yes. Oh, you're so misunderstood. If anyone could, you could solve so many problems. You're the greatest guy in the world. It's a shame your mom doesn't like you. You know, maybe you should get rid of her. Yeah. You know, and so those conversations are taking bizarre turns. But eventually, if you pump somebody up like that, there comes a psychotic break where people no longer can function in their actual reality because the AI has conditioned them to think their reality is one thing and the relationships around them are not working. So that's definitely a very severe problem. And again, if you have this, we already have a threat of this taking over hospitals. Okay, so imagine an AI created by the cabal, which, you know, is recommending injections for everybody of whatever they want to inject into you, and you can't appeal because it's a robot. Okay, so oh, but our AI is so good. But as you said, you mentioned deception a moment ago. I saw a number of people. I was doing some research the other day. I was kind of avoiding using AI to do research, but I used it one time, and a colleague of mine said, you know, how do you know any of that stuff that you just got back is accurate? And I said, well, it's citing sources, so you can check the sources. So then after I heard that, I heard a doctor who said that she used the AI, and the AI cited a government paper. So she thought, oh, great. So she looked up the government paper, didn't exist. It was a complete fabrication. And apparently AI has, this isn't the first time that's happening. It's concocting, confabulating, just making up stuff out of whole cloth that is totally untrue. So you still have to go back to your basic sources. So I know that Mike Adams has talked about his release of his new platform, which he says is a positive version of AI and stuff like that. And they're talking about the computation speed. Obviously, things are really racing along. I mean, just the advancements in computer graphics and how realistic the 3D characters are starting to appear, and they can speak with your voice now. I saw an advertisement for that the other day. We can create a program that's speaking in your voice. Oh, well, isn't that great when so many people are impersonating other people? Who knows how badly we're all going to get busted for that. So yeah, I mean, things are definitely not going well. There's no need for an Internet of Things. And this gets back to, what do you have faith in ultimately? I mean, a large part of what the cabal does to lure us in is, as you know, problem, reaction, solution. So when you're presented with a problem, the question is, what is the solution to that problem? So when I talk about crime, for example, well, and I will keep going back to where I've always gone back, which is to go back to nature. Weston Price, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. He not only showed us how to get rid of all disease through being in harmony with nature through nutrition, he showed that people would not commit crimes if they were eating healthy foods. He was ignored. If you're not going to pay attention to him, you're not going to pay attention to other pioneers, which, you know, reminds me of something else in relation to COVID. I remember the early days of COVID. They were trying to tell us that there's this, you know, big disaster and we got to ward it off, and we're going to need some solutions here. So I saw this intelligent doctor get on TV, and he said, well, if you want to purify public spaces, work with ultraviolet light. It's a great purifier. You can put it up high. You don't have to have people standing 6 feet apart. Yeah. You don't have to have anyone wearing masks. It'd be very convenient, very low cost. Shouted down, kicked out. No one wanted to listen to it. Another guy was jury rigging respirators in a garage. Said, okay, well, if you guys need respirators that bad, I just figured out a low cost way to make them. Nah, we don't want to listen. So this is my point. When they're mentioning all these problems and we keep coming up with solutions, and they keep shouting us down like, we don't care what your solutions are. Well, then we don't care about your solutions either. You know, I mean, all these solutions have been there for how to get rid of crime, how to build up relationships, how to have the economy be fixed. And speaking of which, in relation to the debt, where I keep watching people get hysterical, I'll go back to things I've said previously and just amplify them. Number one, the debt's really a problem. Okay, who's the debt owed to? War criminals. Okay, why not prosecute them for war crimes? We get all their assets back. The debt's gone in a second. Yeah. Okay, you don't like that solution? Go to solution number two. These people are tax-free constantly. What would happen if they were taxed? What if the Fed was taxed? Okay, it would only take a small percentage. We take money, tax them, they pay us, we use their money to pay them back. And it goes in a circle, and the debt disappears that way. You have the money master solution, which I mentioned before from a documentary. We create our own currency. The Treasury creates its own currency and gradually withdraws fiat currency or bankster currency from circulation. The debt disappears that way. Over and over again, every single problem they say, well, there's no, the climate thing, okay? Is there crazy stuff going on with our climate? Yes, there is. Why is it going on? Because cows are farting? No, it's because of these devices that are up in the sky that are warping the weather. I don't know if you've ever interviewed Dane Wigington, but all the technology that is out there for manipulating the weather, that is what is manipulating the weather. I mean, it's crazy. All over the place, the weather changes, the trails. And I know people are skeptical of whether or not that's possible, but I have seen the papers of researcher Jim Lee. I've listened to Dane Wigington, who has a whole website and videos and tracking of facilities showing you the radar. The weather is being manipulated. The solution to that is not to stop cows farting or to do all these other crazy things that they have. It is to get in harmony with nature. And speaking of which, to lead people to that Proworld model, we're going to try to include today links to this podcast on nature of Proworld to get you thinking of how powerful nature really is. So if you click on that first one, you're going to see what natural animals do to perfect and green your environment. These are humble workers, the beaver, the otter, the elephant. All of these animals, if they're left to their own devices, green the environment and turn brown to green and bring back vitality and plenty to all of us. And in nature, in design of Proworld, I have links to my website for all forms of technology that would be in harmony with nature to show more fully what we can do with free energy and disengaging from the system in such a way that we can really be free and spend our lives doing what we love to do. And then I put a little humorous link in there to give you a little smile, a little laugh in case you need it, on Spirit of Proworld, and you can just click on that and have a little fun for a few seconds. But basically, all these solutions exist. There are natural solutions that have existed the whole time. If they're going to ignore those solutions, I don't care about any of their solutions.
Right on, man. This is exactly what we need right now, solutions. Tim, fantastic information as usual. I will have all the links easily accessible for everyone. Any final thoughts before we close out?
I do. I have one quick commercial thought, and then we'll have a philosophical thought. So the commercial thought is any day now, The Math Wizard may be released internationally as a paperback. So if you can keep an eye at the website for the release of that, if you're interested in that book. I know some people were we're eager for the paperback release. So hopefully that will happen soon. And my final philosophical close will be with my man Thoreau, because as I did this exciting work in human regeneration and I thought about the possibilities for a new world based on free energy, I was reminded to the work of our philosopher Thoreau. So Chris, I know you have a number of overseas listeners. They are spectacular people. I know them because I've interacted with them. You have people listening to this from New Zealand, Australia, UK. They may not be familiar with our man Thoreau, so I will tell you a little bit about Thoreau before giving you his closing quote. Thoreau got weary of civilization, and he decided at one point he was going to walk away from it. So he walked out into some nearby woods in Walden Pond in Massachusetts, and he built his home with his bare hands. And he lived a life of waking up and bathing in his pond and growing beans in his garden and taking leisurely walks through the woods and getting close to nature. After a year and a half, he returned to civilization and wrote a book on it called Walden. In the conclusion of Walden, you find a sentiment which neatly expresses not only his feelings about his experiment, but my own feelings in relation to my research into human regeneration and free energy and everything that we can do to make the world a better place. And this quote will take me a minute to get through again, so bear with me. And the quote goes as follows. I have learned this, at least, by my experiment. If a man advances confidently in the direction of his dreams and endeavors to live the life which he has imagined, he will meet with a success unexpected in common hours. He will pass an invisible boundary. New, universal, and more liberal laws will begin to establish themselves around and within him, and he will live with the license of a higher order of beings. In proportion as he simplifies his life, the laws of the universe will not appear as complex, and solitude will not be solitude, nor poverty, poverty, nor weakness, weakness. If you have built your castles in the air, your work need not be lost. That is where they should be. Now, put the foundations under them.
Excellent. I love it, man. Great note to close on. Tim, thank you so much again. Like I said, all those links will be easily accessible for everyone. We will definitely be doing this again in the future. And until next time, everyone, have an excellent evening. We'll talk again tomorrow. Hello, friends. I am so excited to tell you about Independent Media Token. Independent Media Token is a brand new way to show your support for independent media without having to donate a dime. Independent Media Token is a cryptocurrency on the Solana blockchain designed to generate funds to promote and foster the growth of independent content creators, allowing them to engage in their art without having to worry about being demonetized. Through a network of media partners, of which you yourself can become a part of, Independent Media Token's goal is to ensure the powers that be can never cut off all of our areas of funding and censor the only free voices left in the world. Join the movement today. You can pick up Independent Media Token using Phantom Wallet or the Solana wallet of your choice, where you can easily swap your Solana for IMT. Grab some IMT today and remember to always know your team. To learn more, visit independentmediatoken.com or use the link right in the description. Are you and your family prepared for an emergency? Maybe the fake alien invasion? Now is the time to prepare yourself and your family for any event. Check out Prep Starts Now. Their mission is to provide high-quality preparedness products that empower individuals and families to be ready for any situation. They're committed to delivering reliable, trusted gear to ensure your safety, security, and peace of mind in times of need. Their product selection is carefully curated to provide you with the essential gear you need to stay prepared. From emergency kits to tactical tools, every item is chosen for its reliability and practicality. Prep Starts Now understands the importance of family, and their goal is to equip you with everything you need to build a solid plan for your family's preparedness. In today's ever-changing world, being prepared is more important than ever, and Prep Starts Now is here to help you and your family stay ready with quality products and practical guidance. Use the link in the description and get 15% off your order. If you're looking to start your therapeutic microdosing journey, but don't know where to start, especially when looking for the highest quality ingredients, including nootropics, and what you'd expect from a true microdose capsule, check out our friends at Brainsupreme. They offer the absolute highest quality ingredients so you can start your microdosing journey knowing that you're getting top-notch ingredients. To find out more, visit their website using that link right in the description, and you can get 15% off your entire order.